Thank you so much, Eduardo. Thanks for handing over to me. Before I start my presentation, I do indeed want to comment on the comment on to comment on the information that Professor Richter brought to us, that the European Union adopts a co-regulation approach to disinformation. And I think this is justified from two different perspectives. The first one being the fact that when you talk about digital policy in general, there is a tendency to adopt hybrid regulatory arrangements, right? Because especially in the digital sphere, in social media, what we have is the fact that the way the systems are built, the way the private actors conduct their business models, that already implies in an inherent level of regulation to the way these environments work. So what this means is that when there's state policy, ultimately who enforces this policy, who monitors sometimes this policy, is the private agent that is building these systems, right? It's the all boils down to Lessig's idea that in cyberspace code is law. So there's a tendency to adopt co-regulation because it's feasible, right? Because you already have a private agent who is going to be responsible for enforcing these standards, mostly or at least partially through the code that builds social media, that builds these systems. But more than that, I like to think that when we talk about disinformation and these speech-related matters, we're also talking about what is truth or not. So Professor Richter mentioned that are we entitled to a right to truth? I would instantly say no. I think there's a difference between saying that we have a right to information and that we have a right to truth, which is much more philosophical. But what I think that co-regulation relates to this is in the sense that it is not up for the state or any state authority to tell us what is truth or not, right? The content of truth, the content of freedom of expression is to be disputed by civil society, by everyone. So I think that co-regulation also serves in the sense that it brings more people to the table to make the decisions about how to handle this information, how to handle harmful content. So in this sense, it is also an interesting regulatory solution. Now, all that said, I also have my skepticism towards how effective and actually transformative co-regulation can be. But that's not what I prepared to show you today in my presentation. So I'll stop this here, but I'm absolutely available to talk more about this with anyone who is interested. May I share my screen, Eduardo? So thank you so much, Eduardo, Nina, and the whole organization for the invitation to be here today. I deeply apologize that I need to leave earlier because I completely misread the program. I thought the session would be over at 3:30, so I took another appointment, and that is absolutely on me. I'm really sorry about this, and if I don't make it to the whole Q&A, I am sure going to be available should anyone want to be in touch. So my name is Clara. I am a legal scholar originally from Brazil, and I have been living and doing research in Germany for 3 years now. Disinformation is a very important topic in my research agenda. I'm currently coordinating the Digital Disinformation Hub at the Leibniz-lnstitut for Media Research. Our institute has great tradition in multidisciplinary media and communications research, and the idea behind this project is to organize and bring together this expertise to address a problem that is multidimensional by essence. So my particular research is focused on regulatory strategies against disinformation. So what policies should states implement to countermeasure disinformation, which is like one of the direction towards which one of the questions was just headed. So I'll start telling you some of the conceptual premises that guided this research of mine. First, contemporary debates on information manipulation involve different sorts of content and behavior, and it can be quite challenging to narrow down a methodological concept. So across disciplines, we see a lot of different terms being applied, but mostly these two first ones, disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation is usually more popular among social and political sciences, and disinformation is more popular for policy debates. And I think the reason for this is because the main difference between the two of them is intent. So misinformation is supposed to be the information that somebody circulates without knowing it's false, without having any further intention behind it. And disinformation is quite the opposite. So disinformation is usually defined by three elements: falsehood, intention, and harm. So the person knows that information is not true. They have a clear intention to share it in any case in order to cause a certain harm. That can be to a political process, to a person, or financial, or to somebody's reputation, etc. So the definition adopted by the EU Code of Conduct is grounded on these three pillars. And so are several theoretical definitions of disinformation. And I think because disinformation is connected to intent and to a proper structural strategy to cause harm, it is the concept that interests public policy and law studies the most. So in second place, disinformation can have a variety of purposes, as I just mentioned: electoral, political. It can be related to public health, profits, to harm a third party. In third place, it is a multidimensional phenomenon, in the sense that we cannot attribute tendencies or trends of disinformation to one specific factor. It's not all due to technology. It's not all due to politics. It's in fact, rather than thinking about causality, right, about a cause and a consequence, a direct effect, it's more interesting for us to think of a constellation and about how democracy, technologies, how they co-constitute each other. So it's not only technology evolving and changing everything, but democracy and the power struggles in place, they also shape how this technology is being used. So this makes it even harder to address disinformation, because there will be no silver bullet. Ultimately, for the countermeasure debates, what this means is that there will be a role for several different actors in society. So I think digital platforms have a role in having their own policies. The press and fact checkers have a role. Civil society that promotes media literacy has a role. And I believe there's also a role for regulation. And this is where I focus in my research. What are the regulatory strategies that are available for governments to deal with this digital disinformation in particular? So these are my main research questions, considering how governments can threaten freedom of expression. Is there a role for state regulation in the fight against disinformation? I just told you a while ago that we have it, like liberal democracies are also grounded on the fact that governments should not affect or have a say on what is true or on what people can say or not say. So what is the role of governments towards this information? And what would the regulatory target for public policies be? Should governments be regulating speech in order to countermeasure disinformation? So the first thing I did was to have an overall look at disinformation policies that have been implemented in the last 5 years. And I came up with this classification whose main role is to allow for a better understanding and visualization of these policies that are available for governments. So this is not a static classification, but the idea here is for us to try to assess the options that are on the table. So in the first group, I put the strategies that target speech. So these are the policies that are about criminalization or punishing, in, according to civil liability, individuals for spreading, producing, or somehow distributing disinformation. So it's usually criminalization of these conducts or enhancement of pre-existing legislations about libel and slander, for instance. The target here is the content of the message, the individuals, and a few legislations have been adopted in this sense to criminalize speech that can be considered disinformation. And these strategies, they usually have a low trade-off in the sense that they have a high potential to restrict freedom of expression, and they don't promise such good results because they don't address structural disinformation campaigns. So the second target would be data. And here I'm talking about the policies that target data collection and data treatment. This is a very important point in the disinformation debate because data is considered to have a central role in mass disinformation strategies. So these strategies are very well represented by recent and sometimes not so recent data protections legislations that regulate the hypothesis in which data can be used for treatment and ultimately also for also for micro-targeting. And they basically limit the use of data for some purposes. And in some places, we start to see discussions of limiting the use of data for political purposes, specifically for political micro-targeting. And in the third group of strategies are the ones that I call that are aimed at structure. So the target of these policies here are intermediaries, are digital platforms, and their business models. So policies that target structure, they are mostly about liability regimes, transparency obligations, due process and accountability related obligations. And we start to see policies as such being adopted in different legal contexts. So as Professor Richter mentioned, the DSA discussions in Europe definitely go in this direction by going further into what we call duties of care or responsibility obligations. We have seen movements like that in specific countries. Germany is usually mentioned as a benchmark because of the Netzstrategie. We have seen some movement in this direction also in Brazil, as I will show you shortly. And this category of policies can also be known as a shift from liability to responsibility or from liability to duty, mostly meaning that now platforms should be responsible within their business models while exercising their activities and not only liable for damage should they be considered so. The thing about structure policies, they're not all about disinformation. They encompass a broader category of online harms. So they usually also include hate speech and copyright infringements, terrorist content, and etc. So I'm using this framework here to look at the Brazilian case, right? Of course, as I told you, these classification has some limits, but mostly what I'm trying to do is understand the policies that are on the table for Brazil. So when I started doing this, what we had in Brazil was basically a trauma because of the 2018 elections, when micro-targeting techniques were used to disseminate political marketing and false information, mostly through WhatsApp. So the context was of a political crisis that traced back to 2013, and disinformation experience that had already affected democratic processes in other countries. So after the 2018 elections, what we had on the table was a series of policies, of proposals that were mostly among the first group that I showed you here: content, speech, proposals that would say, let's criminalize disinformation. Even the only law that had been approved, this one here, was about criminalizing disinformation in the context of elections, but based on individual responsibility. Last year, as soon as the pandemic started and disinformation kind of came back to the public debate, there was definitely a shift in policy proposals. They were no longer focused on criminal liability anymore, but brought to the table a mix of regulatory strategies, encompassing mostly structural regulation, but also other types of policy that are very well known for people that study internet regulation for a long time, like, for instance, obligations of civil registration and other things I'll show you shortly. What is important to know about these policies is that they have given shape to a bill of law proposal. They started with a series of different proposals. Now they're unified in this one bill of law. That is very much inspired by other foreign legislations, but also it's really hard to pin it down to one single influence or to one single rationale. And I'll show you now. This is kind of a summary of the proposals that have been on the table. Some of them have already fallen out of the official version, but these versions come and go, so we never know what's going to come up next. And this is what we're talking about in terms of strategies in Brazil right now. So at some point, it was required that people would need to have a civil registration identification in order to own a social media account, which can be very restrictive, especially for people that kind of need their anonymity. There's an innovative proposal to regulate private messaging apps, which includes account suspension, forwarding limit, and the very polemic use storage of metadata in order to trace messages. There are a lot of provisions about due processing, content moderation, removal obligations, content moderation requirements, and even a provision that will say illegal content needs to be taken down faster. Now, about content moderation, we just had this week another bill of law from President Bolsonaro that actually wants to stop platforms from moderating content. So that's a whole other set and level of problems that are brought to the table. It has transparency obligations, talks about public interest social network accounts, that would be the ones of government representatives, and proposes also a hybrid institutional arrangement in the form of regulated self-regulation. So I see my 15 minutes just hit, and I have just one more slide that I want to show you with some takeaways. So I think the Brazilian debate is certainly included in a global context, and some of the strategies under discussion are familiar to other debates as well. But before assuming a complete influence or an import from one country to another, I always like to invite people into another perspective, which is the one that Brazil has its own tradition of internet regulation. So around the same time the US was discussing SOPA PIPA in the 2010s, Brazil was also discussing similar bills of law. In 2014, it approved the first national diploma that institutionalized the Bill of Rights for the Internet. It's called the Marco Civil. It has proven beneficial to some extent, but also limited in several others. So I also see these proposals now as a next step in the country's own history of internet regulation. And my second point is that there's definitely a use of this information to push forward other agendas. So despite this information fueling these debates as justifications and as the narrative around the Bill of Law, what we see today is not a proposal to fit to fight disinformation, but clearly something that regulates digital platforms as a whole. And while this is welcome, we also need more consistency on policy justifications, if not only for coherence, for the sake of efficiency and feasibility as well. So these debates also showed us a shift from techniques focused on individual liability to platform regulation. There's also a shift from individual to structure, but that doesn't mean that fundamental rights are safe, because as I showed you, some of these policies will still generate incentive to restrict people's speech or access to digital platforms. And last, I think the Brazilian and the European of these proposals can also be questioned from a perspective of how much promise they indeed have to change the status quo. But I'm going to leave it to that here because I'm 2.5 minutes ahead of my time already. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And once again, my apologies for having to leave early because I misorganized myself. Thank you so much.